In the summer of 1969, a herder crossed the Dzungarian Gobi. He saw something nobody would ever see in the wild again. A small band of wild horses moved along a dry riverbed. Thick necks, upright manes, dun-colored coats built for wind and cold. These were not domestic horses that had simply gone feral. They were the last true wild horses left on Earth. This was a species that had outlived empires and ice ages. Nobody in that moment knew it was the final sighting. There was no camera crew and no survey team nearby. There was no official record made of that encounter. Just a man, a small herd, and the wide brown steppe. The border region was tense and half closed that year. Almost nobody was out there watching for wild horses at all. Within a few years, the searches turned up nothing at all. No tracks showed up anymore in the winter snow. No droppings turned up near the old waterholes either. There were simply no horses left to find, anywhere. The wild population had roamed Central Asia for thousands of years. That population had now gone silent, seemingly overnight. What remained of the species lived only behind fences. Those survivors sat in zoos scattered across Europe and America. They descended from a shrinking handful of captive animals. The wild version of the horse, the untamed one, was gone. It had never known a saddle or a stable. For more than 2 decades, that stood as the ending. Then a valley in central Mongolia rewrote that ending completely. If stories like this hold your attention, this channel is built around them. A subscribe costs nothing, and it helps these recoveries reach more people. The animal is called the Przewalski's horse, an unusual name. It was named after a Russian explorer in the 1870s. Local herders across Mongolia call it takhi, meaning spirit. Some translate it closer to worthy of worship. Old herding families told stories about takhi belonging to no one. That was unlike every domestic horse, tied to a family and a name. Herders who trained domestic horses understood the difference instantly. They knew exactly what made a takhi different the moment they saw one. It is not a wild Mustang gone loose on some island. It is the only horse species never domesticated by humans. Every other horse alive today carries genes shaped by breeding. A farm plow horse, a racing thoroughbred, all of them shaped by us. The Przewalski's horse carries none of that human shaping at all. Its body still runs entirely on its original wild code. It has 66 chromosomes instead of the usual 64. Its mane stands stiff and upright, not long and flowing. Its frame is stockier, built for brutal Mongolian winters, not for pulling carts. Fossil evidence suggests horses like this once ranged across Eurasia. Cave paintings in France show animals that looked much the same. By the time written history begins, the range had already shrunk. It had narrowed down to Mongolia and the borderlands of western China. A grazing horse does more than simply eat grass and move on. Its teeth crop plants differently than a deer or gazelle does. That keeps certain grasses short while letting others go to seed. Its hooves break up crusted ground in a specific way. That lets water soak into the soil instead of running off. Remove that kind of grazer from a steppe for long enough. The grass itself slowly starts to change its character. Some patches thicken while others thin out entirely. That shift changes which insects and birds can use the ground. Losing the horse was never just about losing one species. For thousands of years, herds moved across grasslands into western China. They shared that ground with saiga antelope and wild camels. Eventually, herders pushed their own livestock into the same pastures. As human settlement expanded, the wild horses steadily lost ground. Hunting reduced their numbers, year after difficult year. Competition with domestic herds squeezed them further, pasture by pasture. Harsh winters, the kind Mongolians called zud, could wipe out entire bands. Military activity along contested borders kept adding to the pressure. None of this happened out of any malice toward the species. Herders simply hunted for meat during lean, difficult years. Livestock needed exactly the same pastures the wild horses needed. Nobody was trying deliberately to erase an entire species. It simply happened anyway, through ordinary decisions repeated for decades. By the middle of the century, sightings had become genuinely rare. Scientists and hunters alike noted how few horses remained. Local reports grew thinner every year, more second-hand, less certain. Nobody was tracking any kind of clean countdown to zero. There was no scoreboard slowly ticking toward extinction for anyone to watch. The decline simply kept happening, one bad winter at a time. It continued until there was almost nothing left to count. Ironically, the reason the species survived at all started decades earlier. That reason had nothing to do with saving anything at all. In the early 1900s, European expeditions traveled into Mongolia. They went specifically to capture wild horse foals for zoos. Collectors wanted living specimens for zoos and private menageries in Europe. Hunters would chase down a herd of horses on horseback. They would shoot the adult mares just to reach the young, then they would rope whatever foals had managed to survive. It was a brutal method by absolutely any measure available. Many foals died during the capture process itself. More died during the long overland transport toward railheads and ports. Only a small fraction ever reached a European paddock alive. Every mare killed to reach a foal mattered enormously to the population. That was one more animal subtracted from an already shrinking herd. The same herd already sat under pressure from hunting and grazing loss. Those same expeditions were making the species' disappearance more certain. Nobody fully reckoned with that contradiction until decades later. The ones that survived became the entire genetic future of the species. Nobody had planned it that way at the time. By the 1940s, the captive population had shrunk further still. The weight of a world war fell on it too. The famous breeding herd at Eskania Nova sat in what is now Ukraine. It was devastated during the fighting of World War II. Records were lost, and animals were killed or scattered widely. Years of careful breeding work nearly vanished in a single stretch. When the dust settled, conservationists realized something genuinely alarming. Every Przewalski's horse alive on the planet traced back to one group. That founding group numbered somewhere around a dozen animals total. Every future foal depended on the genetics inside that small circle. One bad decade of breeding mistakes could have erased the species. In 1959, an international studbook was created for the species. It tracked every single Przewalski's horse living in captivity worldwide. Zoos in Prague, Munich, and dozens of other cities coordinated breeding. They ran the whole effort like a slow-motion rescue mission. Geneticists studied bloodlines the way accountants study financial ledgers closely. A horse in Prague might be paired on paper with one in Germany. That pairing depended purely on which bloodlines had drifted too close together. A dozen founding animals sounds like plenty, until you understand inbreeding. Cousins mating with cousins concentrates hidden weaknesses instead of diluting them. Fertility can drop, and immune systems can weaken over generations. Foals can be born smaller, or fail to survive their first winter. Every pairing decision the studbook made carried real risk either way. It was a decision about which weaknesses to gamble on. There was no room left in the plan for a wrong guess. Slowly, though, the population numbers crept upward across the decades. They were tracked on index cards, long before anyone used computers. But a horse behind a zoo fence is not truly a wild horse. It does not learn to read a storm crossing open grassland. It does not learn to avoid a wolf pack at dusk. Those particular skills had not passed down through generations of captivity. The species existed, technically, in enclosures on a different continent. But the wild version, the one that vanished from the Gobi, stayed gone. By the 1970s, conservationists in the Netherlands asked a bigger question. Could these zoo-born horses ever function as wild animals again? A husband and wife team founded an organization around exactly that goal. They gathered horses from scattered zoos across several countries. They moved those horses onto open land in the Netherlands and France. Instead of paddocks, the horses lived on wide semi-wild reserves there. They had to find their own food across open terrain. Stallions competed for mares the way wild stallions always had. Herds formed and reformed with every new breeding season that passed. Foals grew up watching adult horses respond to weather and threats. They were not watching zookeepers deliver hay on a fixed schedule. It was not a perfect substitute for the open Gobi steppe. but it sat far closer than any zoo enclosure ever had. Slowly, across the 1980s, these reserves produced generation after generation. Those horses behaved less like exhibits and more like an actual herd. By the end of the decade, the reserves held enough horses. Organizers could seriously plan an actual return migration, not a symbolic one. Several possible return sites across Mongolia and China were studied first. Most were ruled out fairly fast for practical reasons. Grazing land was often already stretched thin by domestic livestock. Sometimes the terrain no longer matched what the species truly needed. Surveyors walked candidate valleys across multiple full seasons of weather. They counted existing grazers and mapped every available water source. They estimated how many horses each valley could realistically feed. All of that happened before anyone finally signed off on Hustai. Meanwhile, political change in Mongolia opened a door shut for decades. The country moved gradually away from Soviet-era restrictions of the past. International conservation groups gained access to discuss what once seemed unthinkable, taking the horses home, finally, after all those lost years. Multiple countries stepped forward, each with a separate reintroduction plan. Each plan targeted a different patch of the horse's former range. The Dutch focused their own effort on a valley called Hustai. That valley had not been chosen at random by anyone. Hustai sits roughly 100 kilometers from Mongolia's capital city. It is a stretch of rolling steppe and low mountains. Wild grass still grows there, uninterrupted, for miles in every direction. Rivers cut through the valley, feeding grass through most of the year. The valley already held red deer, gray wolves, and Mongolian gazelle. Marmots and golden eagles worked the thermals overhead as well. It was not empty land simply waiting to be filled. It was a working stretch of steppe missing exactly one piece. The seasons there swing hard, from one extreme to another. Spring brings a fast thaw and a short burst of green grass. Herds depend on that grass to rebuild strength after winter. Summer turns the whole valley gold and dry under direct sun. Autumn brings the rut, when stallions roar and clash over mares. Winter locks the valley under snow and wind for months. That final season decides which horses make it through to spring. Local herding families were also willing to cooperate closely. Mongolian and Dutch organizers spent years preparing the ground beforehand. They negotiated grazing agreements between local livestock and future wild horses. They trained rangers to monitor animal health and track predators. They built quarantine pens for horses arriving after the long transport. They mapped water sources across every single season of the year. None of it guaranteed any kind of eventual success at all. Reintroducing a species gone from the wild had never been attempted at this scale. Nobody could promise the horses would remember how to survive alone. But by 1992, all of that preparation was finally finished. A small group of Przewalski's horses, raised on European reserves, was loaded for transport. None of them had ever seen the valley waiting for them. Their ancestors had walked that same ground for thousands of years. The trip itself took several days from start to finish. Horses moved by truck and then by cargo plane. They crossed borders they had absolutely no way to understand. They were sedated just enough to stay calm throughout the trip. Handlers checked on the animals constantly at every single stop. They adjusted temperature and airflow, watching closely for any signs of stress. A horse this genetically rare could not simply be replaced if something went wrong. When they finally reached Hustai, they were not released immediately onto open ground. Handlers held them first in large adjustment pens instead. Those fenced enclosures sat inside the valley itself, close to the open steppe. The animals could grow used to new smells and light gradually. Weeks passed slowly, and then entire months went by. Rangers watched closely, recording every small sign of adjustment or stress. They noted which animals grazed calmly and which paced the fence. Slowly, deliberately, the gates were opened wider and wider. Horses raised on manicured European reserves stepped into unfamiliar open land. That land was ground their ancestors had abandoned generations earlier. The first hooves touched fresh Hustai soil in 1992. Headlines around the world called it a species returning from extinction, but inside the valley itself, the real test was only beginning. A horse raised in captivity does not automatically know winter survival. It does not know which slope holds snow too deep to cross. It does not know where a hidden spring keeps flowing in freezing weather. Some of that knowledge had been lost across generations of captivity. The horses now had to relearn it under real conditions. Real consequences waited for any failure, and nobody could teach them from outside. This channel covers recoveries just like this one, every single week. Species written off as gone, that somehow found their way back. If that is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe now. We are about to get into that first brutal Mongolian winter. The first hard winter arrived faster than anyone had hoped. Snow buried the grass under a crust of solid ice. That ice could cut a horse's legs if it pawed through carelessly. Temperatures on the steppe dropped far below freezing for weeks straight. Wolves had never hunted wild Przewalski's horses in living memory before. They tested the herds and picked off animals caught unprepared. Some horses died during that first difficult stretch of winter. Rangers recorded every single loss, worried the entire project might collapse. Killing the wolves was never seriously considered as an option. Park managers had promised to protect the whole valley, not just newcomers. The response instead was closer monitoring, not any kind of culling. Rangers watched which packs targeted horses and adjusted release timing accordingly. One young stallion, born on a Dutch reserve, lost most of his band. He lost them to a single brutal winter storm entirely. Rangers found him alone at the valley's edge, days later. He was thinner, but he had somehow managed to survive. But something else was happening across the herd at the same time. Surviving horses started forming the same social structures their ancestors used. A dominant stallion gathered his mares into a defensive circle formation. Foals stayed protected at the very center of that formation. Bachelor males formed loose groups along the edges of the herd. They watched and waited for a future chance to challenge. This was not learned behavior in the way a foal learns from a trainer. It looked closer to old instinct resurfacing after decades of captivity. Rangers who had worried these horses forgot how to be wild, found real proof otherwise. Some of that knowledge had simply been waiting all along. It stayed encoded, ready to switch back on when needed. Each surviving winter added a little more confidence to the project. Each spring brought new foals born entirely out on the open steppe. No human hand was involved in their birth at all. Rangers began fitting some adults with tracking collars around this time. Grief over the early losses slowly turned into useful protective data. Word of the early success spread quickly through conservation circles worldwide. Other countries pushed forward their own Mongolian reintroduction sites soon after. A French-backed effort released horses into the Great Gobi region. That site sat closer to the original 1969 sighting near China. A German-led project established a third population at Komintal, further west. None of these separate efforts moved forward in complete isolation. Rangers and scientists compared notes constantly across international borders. They tracked genetics and survival rates between separate wild herds. This marked the first time that had happened in modern history. Horses were occasionally even moved between sites to manage bloodlines. That was the same careful math the old European Studbook once used. It was now applied across open Mongolian terrain instead of index cards. Slowly, the picture shifted from 3 fragile experiments into something else entirely. It began to resemble an actual, sustainable recovery for the species. Hustai's population in particular kept climbing steadily year after year. Herds split as they grew, claiming new stretches of valley. They competed and adapted the way wild populations always had before. Local herding families started noticing wild horses on the horizon regularly. It became an ordinary part of the view again, nothing unusual. Ecotourism grew around the park, giving nearby communities a direct incentive. That incentive gave them real reason to protect the herds, not compete. Guides who once herded livestock began leading visitors out at dawn. Simple viewing platforms went up along ridgelines overlooking known grazing routes. Those platforms sat far enough back to avoid disturbing the herds. They still sat close enough to watch a band move at sunrise. Visitors learned to read the same signs rangers had studied for years. A raised tail meant alarm, a wide circle meant a threat detected. Rangers who once worried about a single hard winter faced different problems now. They were managing population growth instead of population collapse entirely. That was a genuinely different kind of problem to have. For years, the species carried an official label reflecting that 1969 disappearance, extinct in the wild. The classification read, plainly and permanently. It was a technical label, but also a kind of scar. It stood as a permanent record of an earlier failure to survive. As Hustai and other sites kept producing wild-born foals, things shifted. Conservation authorities eventually revisited that old, painful classification carefully. The horses were no longer surviving purely through human intervention alone. They were breeding, competing, and adapting entirely on their own terms now. Eventually, the classification changed, easing from extinct in the wild. It moved first to critically endangered, then improved again later. Herds kept growing steadily across multiple separate Mongolian sites by then. Paperwork rarely captures the true weight of a moment like that. For people who had spent decades moving horses across continents, it mattered enormously. They had negotiated grazing rights and endured brutal Gobi winters, waiting. A label change on an international list meant far more than bureaucracy. It meant the horse from that Gobi riverbed had a home again. Today, several hundred Przewalski's horses roam free across the valley at Hustai. They are split across multiple herds managing their own separate territory. Rangers still monitor the population, tracking births and movement patterns closely. Daily survival no longer depends on any fence or feeding schedule. A typical patrol now means counting foals and checking collar batteries. It no longer means delivering hay or standing quarantine watch overnight. Most attempts to return an extinct in the wild species do not end this way. Founding populations are often simply too small to recover fully. Habitat has often changed too much, or funding runs out early. Hustai somehow avoided all three of those common traps entirely. Still, nobody involved would call any single year of it easy. Visitors who travel out to the park can watch real wild behavior. A stallion defends his mares against a rival male, unscripted. This happens on the same open grassland where the species first evolved. Foals born wild, to parents born wild, to grandparents once released. That kind of unbroken wild lineage did not exist anywhere for decades. Every one of those foals grows up without ever touching a fence. No human hand shapes how any of them learn to run or fight. Beyond Hustai, the horses now hold ground at two other sites. Great Gobi and Komi in Tal both host separate wild populations today. All three trace back to that same narrow founding bloodline. That bloodline nearly did not survive the 20th century at all. Przewalski's horses are not the only species to wear that grim label. The Arabian oryx vanished from its desert range at one point. It survived only in captivity before eventually returning to Oman. The scimitar-horned oryx followed nearly the same difficult path, later returning to Chad. Few other reintroductions have run this long, with this much data. Few have involved an animal carrying such a grim original label. It remains, even now, a genuinely fragile recovery in several ways. A population this genetically narrow will always carry real ongoing risk. One truly catastrophic winter could still undo decades of careful work. Modern genetic tools have at least made that risk easier to watch. Researchers can now test genetic diversity directly from collected dung samples. No capture or sedation is required for that kind of testing anymore. That would have sounded like science fiction to those 1959 rangers. They filled out index cards by hand, one animal at a time. The tools available today have changed almost completely since then. The underlying math, protecting a narrow gene pool, has never changed at all. But fragile is simply not the same thing as failed outright. The species that herder watched vanish along that dry riverbed persists. It now has thousands of descendants living free across those same grasslands. Their ancestors had abandoned that ground generations earlier, seemingly for good. This recovery was built one careful decision at a time. It was built by people who refused to accept that gone meant gone forever. There was no single dramatic rescue behind this entire story either. No lone hero single-handedly brought this particular species back from nothing. It took a Dutch foundation willing to gamble on semi-wild reserves. It took a Mongolian park willing to negotiate with local herders. It took rangers willing to stand through brutal winters, watching closely. It took a studbook tracking a dozen surviving horses like a lifeline. That effort continued decade after decade, long before anyone knew the outcome. What happened at Hustai did not undo that 1969 disappearance. The wild horses that vanished that year are genuinely still gone. Whatever knowledge and behavior died alongside them is also gone forever. But their descendants learned to be wild again anyway, regardless. They did it on the same steppe, under that same wide sky. They are watched now by rangers instead of hunters with rifles. They are watched by tourists instead of expedition crews chasing foals. Somewhere in Hustai tonight, a herd moves across dark, open grassland. There is not a single fence anywhere in sight around them. They are doing exactly what wild horses did before 1969. It is exactly what nobody was certain they would ever do again. Nobody knows the name of that herder from the Dzungarian Gobi. He had no way of knowing what his sighting would become. It became the final line in what looked like a closing chapter. That chapter eventually reopened in a valley he likely never visited. If this story of the last wild horses found its way to you, good. That is exactly what this channel exists for. Subscribe for more recoveries just like this one. We will see you again in the very next one.